You're listening to the DolphinsTalk.com podcast network. Welcome to Dolphins Talk Weekly, your one-stop audio breakdown of all of this week's Miami Dolphins news. Now, here is your host, Kevin Dern.
This episode of Dolphins Talk Weekly is brought to you by Caneswear. Caneswear is the place to go for officially licensed apparel for the Miami Dolphins, Miami Heat, the Hurricanes, Florida Panthers, and all of the professional and college teams in South Florida. Looking for the latest jersey, a birthday gift, or the newest hat to hit the market of your favorite South Florida team? Check out Caneswear for their overwhelming selection of sports apparel. Located at 2655 South University Drive in Davie, Florida, Caneswear has it all. Not in South Florida? No worries. Visit Caneswear.com to shop their inventory from the comfort of your home, and they'll ship to you. International fans, too. Caneswear.com is the spot Miami fans shop. That's Caneswear.com, Caneswear.com. And welcome to another episode of Dolphins Talk Weekly. I'm your host, Kevin Dern. Follow me on Twitter at KevinMD4. Flying solo for this week's podcast, which is recapping the Dolphins' 20-13 preseason victory over the Atlanta Falcons on Friday, with the Washington Commanders set to come into town for some joint practices in another preseason game this week. As I record this on Sunday night, you'll probably hear this Monday or Tuesday. But good to be back, good to have football back, even if we only saw maybe a handful of guys that'll actually be out on the field come week one on Sunday. Still good to have football back, and living here in southeast Indiana near southwest Ohio, we've got the high school season starting up in 2 weeks, college season not long after that, and about a month from the actual NFL season. So we're almost there. But first, I would be remiss if we didn't start this episode off with a new whiskey review. And I promised this on the new Dolphins Talk Discord, Dolphins Talk Extra, so make sure you check that out. But I was actually at the liquor store a couple weeks ago, and kind of just on a whim, didn't really know what I was looking for, didn't really have a plan going in, and bought a bottle of Legic 10, which is made by the distillery Tobermory, which is one of the islands in Scotland. So it's an island scotch. And here we go. We'll sip this one. So that one, the islands are always kind of tricky because they're a little bit like the Highlands, and they kind of bleed into some of the flavors you get from like a Campbelltown, like a Springbank, if you've ever had that, or Glen Scotia, or one of the Isla scotches. Like this one kind of hits your tongue almost like it's kind of effervescent, like you're drinking almost like a Sprite. And then you get kind of a second wave of flavor, which is more of like the oak, the briny, kind of like the sea salt air that you would get in an Isla scotch, but it's not quite there. A little bit of vanilla on the back of it. Almost feels like this one, it's aged 10 years. I wonder what would happen if they aged it for another 2 or another 4. Not bad though. I'll give that one a 3.9 out of 5. 3.9 out of 5 for Legic 10 from the Tobermory distillery, one of the Isles of Scotland on the Isle of Mull. So that's our whiskey review for this segment. Now, let's dive into the preseason game, and we'll just kind of table set this or level set this. Overall, it's about what a preseason game should be. Like, you're not coming out seeing rapid fire, up and down the field scoring. I watched several other preseason games, and this is about the kind of level you get at the NFL. If you look at the Dolphins starting 11 on offense and defense, I don't think they would have, barring an injury, any of those 22 guys out there as a starter come week one against the Jacksonville Jaguars, unless there's an injury. So you kind of have to level set with that. And kind of one of the things I've seen, and it's, football's back, and there's the knee-jerk reactions. It's that the quarterback play was just trash, and we need a new backup right away. And let's hit the brakes on that. Look at some of the other games around the league. Pretty much any team that's going to have to rely on a backup quarterback for any period of time is probably going to have their season shot. Just looking at the caliber of play you're going to get, like, probably the only instances you're going to see where you might have a chance are if there's a team who's got like a quarterback in waiting, kind of like Atlanta with Michael Penix, or if J.J. McCarthy doesn't win the job in Minnesota, maybe Minnesota's going to be okay if Sam Darnold ends up winning that starting gig. But I mean, look at these teams. The Falcons were 16 out of 40 passing. Not much better, or not actually worse than Miami. I think combined, the teams were 28 out of 73 throwing the ball in this game. I watched a good chunk of the Bengals and Buccaneers game on Saturday night. It's not much better. So this whole panic and like, let's go get Ryan Tannehill thing, let's pump the brakes on this a little bit. There's a reason now that Skylar Thompson got that start over Mike White, and by all accounts, and I know 3 people who've watched practices personally have all said basically Skylar has outplayed Mike White, other than maybe the 2 joint practices against Atlanta. Now, neither were great during the game, but I think it's easy to see why Skylar Thompson kind of outplayed Mike White. And again, you have to level set this. Mike White's going up against guys that are probably the 3s and the 4s, guys that are probably going to be playing in the UFL or the CFL moving forward, whereas Skylar Thompson got reps against guys who, are probably 2s and 3s or practice squad guys. So you have to kind of level set that there. And then defensively, I guess this is kind of the one little bit of an outlier, is how good Miami was against the run. Especially, again, Atlanta not having their starters in, not having Bijan Robinson or Tyler Algier playing. But you'd at least expect them to be able to run the ball a little better than they did, just kind of given what they've done the past couple of years. I know Arthur Smith is gone, but I think they mustered 81 yards on 30 carries, and 21 of that came on a scramble by Nathan Rourke. So Miami did a really nice job against the run. Typically, you kind of see things get a little wonky once you start going to the real bottom part of the bench in preseason games, and it really didn't happen for the Dolphins. So that's a positive sign. But again, you're not facing a starting caliber offensive line or starting caliber running back. So just something to keep in mind as we kind of go through these discussions here about the game. I was pleased to see how well the Dolphins ran the ball at times against Atlanta. And the defense, I think, kind of showed us some interesting flavors, what we got. So when they had the first lineup come out in the first half, when you actually had the edge rushers, Quentin Bell and Grayson Murphy in the game, the structure of the defensive front was essentially the 4-2 nickel wide 9 stuff that we've seen really since we acquired Bradley Chubb in 2022, whether it was from Poyer or Fangio or Weaver on Friday night. That structure is probably what we're going to see a lot of, and it's something that you're accustomed to, especially once you get Jaylen Phillips and Bradley Chubb back. That's probably what you're going to see a lot of the defense operate out of. And it was interesting to me that they had Brandon Pilley, who's more of a true nose tackle, out there with Deshaun Hand, which makes me think that they're more comfortable playing like a bigger body guy like a T.R. Tart or Benito Jones in that role, even when they have to play 3 technique at times, than maybe Vic Fangio was, or certainly Josh Boyer was a couple years ago. Now, obviously, you had Christian Wilkins, who only 310 pounds, but can play like a big guy and eat double teams or penetrate. I think Miami's going to have to be a little more choosy based on down and distance situations moving forward. But it was interesting that they went to that structure. And then once they got to the second half, obviously you had Grayson Murphy got hurt during the game. I haven't seen an update on that yet, other than he had his leg in a brace after the game. But they basically went to a true four-man under-over style front where you had basically three bigs, three defensive tackles, and then like Cam Brown sort of cameoing as a defensive end. And then they ended up just going 4 true defensive tackles out there at one point with like Neville Gallimore and I think Jonathan Harris acting as defensive ends in that situation. I don't know that you would necessarily do that thing in the regular season, but schematically, I know Miami has messed around with this dating back to OTAs when they put Zach Sealer as one of those defensive ends. Now, because of injuries, it kind of morphed into this weird thing where you had Sealer and Campbell, and then now Emmanuel Ogba's gotten looks in it. And I thought it was pretty telling, the guys that were not dressed for the game. Coach talked about Chop Robinson kind of having a little tweak or something, but they also didn't dress Mo Kamara. And I think that's telling in a lot of ways. Usually the guys who don't dress are guys that they know they're going to at least be able to have as a contributor during the regular season. So I don't think there's necessarily a ton of spots up for grabs. If you're going to make the 53-man roster, which we did this a couple episodes ago, I think the last one I did solo, you can look at that roster and say there's probably 40 to 45 guys where you can be like, okay, we can probably write this guy down in pen. The only way he's not making it is like if he gets hurt or if he gets traded, out of the blue. And I'm not hinting at any trade forthcoming. I have no intel on that at all. But you can kind of tell who's on the roster and who the guys are that are competing for those spots. So that's kind of what I wanted to do with this episode, is kind of go position by position and kind of talk through my thoughts on that group after the game. So we'll just start it off. We'll go offense, defense, special teams, and go from there. We'll start with the quarterbacks. Skylar Thompson went against some of the guys who you're probably going to see in the rotation for Atlanta, some of the pass rushers, Ebikite, and then Braylon Trice. Those guys are going to be on the roster. And, Miami had some pretty quick pressures given up, and particularly the play where Keon Smith got hurt. He got beat bad inside. I think that was Zach Harrison, and then Ebikite beat Ryan Hayes around the side, and Ryan Hayes drove his guy into Keon Smith's knee. Keon Smith has a torn ACL, and he's out for the year now. So unfortunate for Keon, because I thought he might be the guy who they would peg as like lineman number 9 as sort of a guard tackle swing guy. I think now you're probably looking at the prospect of Lester Cotton's probably going to make the roster again, and played the 3rd most snaps out of any lineman last year. I think we know what we have, but is that an ideal roster addition? I don't know. I think a lot of that hinges on Isaiah Wynn and if and when he comes back at this point. But with Skylar, the kind of the MO on him has always been he's a little bit slow to process, and it looks like AOL Instant Messenger dial-up compared to like Tua, who's flying through the reads and getting the ball out in 2.5 seconds or less most of the time. Just not the case with Skylar Thompson, but I think we saw some good ability to get the ball outside the numbers. There was the one terrible drop that Willie Snead had early on in the game. It hit him right in the hands. Not a lot of favors being done. I think some of the play calling was a little suspect, like the very first pass, the swing pass to Jeff Wilson. Tanner Connor got obliterated on a block, but not a play you would want to run. And then Thompson got to that progression pretty slow. Connor misses the block, a whole lot of bad on that. But is that a play that you would get to faster, get through faster in the regular season if that's Tua throwing to Achane with Durham Smythe out front? That might work. So you have to understand, again, that these are, the second and third string guys kind of putting this offense together. And it's a pretty vanilla offense. I think Kyle Krabs had a great stat where I think Miami last year was in 12 personnel 8% of the time on average during a game, and they're in 12 personnel like almost 75% of this game because it's preseason and they're keeping it vanilla. So with Skylar, I think there's still sort of that gamer aspect of it. Like, I've talked to people who've seen him at practice and they're just like, you don't really see it. But then he kind of turns it on in a team situation, or he can move around, he can make some plays. He still has a pretty big arm. Would you be comfortable, and, knock on wood, if Tua misses like 3 or 5 games or something like that, are you comfortable with Skylar Thompson navigating your team through that portion of the schedule? You're probably not super comfortable with it, but I think you could probably live with it. And I would imagine, this is the other thing people take out of context here, is if Tua did get hurt and had to miss a game, you're putting Skylar Thompson with much better players around him than what you saw Friday night, just given the drop-off of starter to, 2s and 3s in the NFL. I think there's a good chance that Skylar plays better when he's elevated with better players around him, because you can get through some of that stuff faster. You're not facing pressure right up the middle as quickly, that sort of thing. Mike White, I've never been a big fan of his. Like, just such a statue in the pocket the other night. Some of the throws, we don't really know what he was doing. Made some good ones that were dropped. I think Braylon Sanders had a bad drop with him. I think Snead had another. Quite honestly, the only receiver, running routes and catching passes that looked like he made the team was River Craycraft. Now, I think Malik Washington's going to make it, but we didn't really get to see him with much of a chance, as an actual receiver. Looked good as a returner, looked good on the end-around play. More on the receivers in a minute, so Mike White I think he's third and kind of falling back in that battle right now. Now, again, you got to remember, there is the practice squad rule this year where you can keep a quarterback on the practice squad and elevate him as many times as you want. There is no 30-game limit for a quarterback like there is with positional players. Just something to keep in mind. The running backs, we knew Miami had a lot of talent. I think Jaylen Wright, to me, was probably the best guy Miami had on the field on offense on Friday. That kind of speed, that kind of vision, the ability to cut. I would say, you probably don't need to play him in the rest of the preseason, but you might have to because of some of the injuries. Jeff Wilson, I think, is Jeff Wilson at this point. Chris Brooks looked like the Chris Brooks we saw last year. And something tells me that if Mike McDaniel has his way, he'll keep all 5 running backs on the roster. I think it might be more of a case where you get to keep 4 plus 1 on the practice squad if you can get that arrangement. Really nothing more you need to see from any of those guys. I think we kind of know what they are, but was especially impressed with Jaylen Wright. And then I thought Chris Brooks, for a big guy who's 6'1", 226, still has some nice vision and can kind of put a foot in the ground and accelerate, especially on the perimeter, which makes him a little bit of a tricky player to try and tackle for a defender. Didn't play Alec England in the game, so nothing really there. The running backs were they are what they thought we were, and that's a good thing. Receivers-wise, I think right now, unless you have any more injuries, it's pretty clear who your 6 guys are going to be on the roster if they keep 6. Obviously, Hill, Waddle, I think Odell Beckham, if healthy, is on it. I think right now River Craycraft is probably number 4 until we see a little more from Malik Washington. But I think Malik Washington showed us enough as a returner and on the end around where you can at least keep him as a gadget player until you feed him more of the offense. And then Braxton Berrios is probably that last guy just because of his ability to return kicks and punts. So, I think the Braylon Sanders experiment has probably about run its course. Willie Snead, I'm giving a little bit more of a leash to just because he's only been there for, 10 days or something, but pretty bad drops in the game. And then really nothing from the rest of the guys was inspiring. They've talked up Anthony Schwartz a little bit. I know he missed the game because of an injury. This is really the moment, like, Eric Ezukama is costing himself a huge opportunity here because he's missing snaps because of a soft tissue injury. This could have been a game to really showcase himself and what he can do, not just for the Dolphins, but for other NFL teams. And he's not out there. So that one, if he can come back and play, I think it's something you would want to see moving forward. Tight end, pretty telling that they put Julian Hill as one of the inactive guys. To me, I think that means he's on the squad. Through this game, there's really nothing that I would say that Tanner Connor, Jody Fortson, or Hayden Rucci kind of showed where it's like, okay, they're on the squad. But I think they all kind of had moments where you're like, okay, I want to see a little bit more, And then if you could combine Rucci's blocking with Connor's athleticism and Jody Fortson's build into one player, you've probably got a solid fourth tight end. But I don't know that the numbers are going to be able to allow Miami to keep a fourth tight end on the roster. Like, just looking at those three, it's almost like you've got a one-to-one analog of each guy. Hayden Rucci, his blocking ability. Watch some of the runs where Jaylen Wright, especially the one where he scored, is kind of like a Durham Smythe. Big blocker, not a real great athlete. We don't know much about Rucci's hands yet, but very impressive blocker. And then, Connor can sort of do some of that receiving stuff, but maybe not the best analogy. But Hayden Rucci would be a guy I'd be inclined to say, okay, let's see more of him. Maybe we stash him on the practice squad and use him as a blocking tight end if you're going through a stretch without Smythe or Julian Hill, during the season. Offensive line, I think this has been kind of the key topic for Dolphins throughout the offseason, and they won't stop beating the dead horse. Keon Smith was tried at left guard, as he has been tried every year since 2021. That was something Brian Flores did. They did it with Mike McDaniel both years. Like, it's not new. They've done it. Unfortunately, he's out for the year with a torn ACL. So that stinks for Keon. But rather than going out and signing someone like a Greg Van Roten or a Mark or Glowinski or somebody like that, they just brought back Chasen Hines, who they cut earlier in the week. So a little bit of hubris there at play in terms of what they think about the guard market and their own ability to put guards in place, which is why I think, coming out of that game, Lester Cotton's probably pretty well entrenched now, barring an injury. So obviously the star of the show was Patrick Paul, the second-round pick out of Houston. Now again, he's playing rotational players like Ebikite, Braylon Trice, and did fairly well. I think if you watch it, and YouTuber Ryder McConville broke down some All-22 film, if you want to check that out, you still see some of the wonkiness in his technique where guys will kind of try and cross-step him and get inside. He's just so long and has such a huge wingspan where it almost doesn't matter. Like, if he's able to get his hand on you, he's just so big and strong and long, you're not going to beat him inside. But you can kind of get him on skates a little bit technique-wise. In the run game, he was outstanding. Like, this is the scenario in a preseason game where you say, okay, like, we already know he's going to be on the team because he's a second-round pick. Like, the pedigree's there. But this is a scenario where I would say, okay, you already know what you have in Teron Armstead. So, like, whatever series they want to give, like, Tua and the starting offense, you probably don't need to play Teron Armstead more than a couple plays, if at all. So maybe you put Patrick Paul out there with the starters. Like, we know what Kendall Lamb is, and I think the fact that he didn't play, and now you have the injury to Keon Smith, probably solidifies his status as, like, the true swing tackle. But if you get in a game situation where Armstead gets hurt, I might feel comfortable playing Patrick Paul as a left tackle ahead of Kendall Lamb, just based on what we saw the other night. but you still want to go out and see him against like true starters if and when you can in the preseason. Really the next guy that kind of impressed me was Sean Harlow. He kind of came in and stabilized things at left guard when Keon Smith went out. Didn't know much about him other than I knew he played center at Oregon State in college. Kind of a long, lean guy, so he gives you some positional flexibility. He moved pretty well. And then, honestly, I thought Lester Cotton was kind of the third best guy. Didn't really require him to do much, which is fine. That's kind of who Lester Cotton is. Just keep his assignment simple, and he'll do a decent enough job. Again, played third most snaps of any lineman last year for the Dolphins. So, I think he's probably on the team. Jack Driscoll, I thought looked better as a right guard than he did as a center, but I think you can see that positional flexibility. Both he and Liam have it. And then we know Lester Cotton has cross-trained at center before as well. So I think now you've got three guys who can play guard and center. I think Driscoll is probably one of the backups you would target to keep. I've seen a lot of people talk up Ryan Hayes, and again, I think this is the importance of context. He got beat pretty bad early in the game when it was Ebikite and Trice. Later in the game, when he's going up against guys that aren't going to be on the roster, he started to do a lot better as a right tackle. Now, fair shake to Hayes. He was a left tackle by nature at Michigan. I don't know how much right tackle he's been played at during the preseason, in training camp and such. I know he's gotten reps at right guard, but not at right tackle, to my knowledge. So that was a tough ask. But he didn't look very good against like the caliber of player that's going to be in a rotation. So I think that's almost kind of like your next Keon Smith-like project, and I could see them, cutting Hayes and putting him through waivers onto the practice squad to try and keep that development and have that type of a player. But he just doesn't look ready. Like, he's got the footwork, but he doesn't have the length, the strength, the power, the timing to get some of those dropbacks, or setups for dropbacks. And I think that's another thing fans kind of gloss over. Like a pretty large chunk of what Miami does in the pass game is based off of action. It's based off of some type of run action, play action, or RPO. We didn't really see that on Friday night. It's just the basic vanilla offense because you're trying to evaluate guys one-on-one. You saw a lot of five wides, a lot of just straight catch, rock, and throw from Thompson and Mike White. Like, that wasn't a full-fledged game plan by any means. So, and I do think that is the nightmare scenario where, like, if the Dolphins are in a game, fourth quarter, they can't run the ball on an opponent, which has happened before. Philadelphia last year is probably the biggest example that comes to mind. Buffalo's had our number in the ground game a couple times under the McDaniel era. But it's like if you're down by 2 scores and you got to throw it 25 games where your run action stuff isn't working, you're just straight dropping back. About the only lineman you can trust in that situation is Teron Armstead. He's still a phenomenal pass protector, probably one of the top 3 or 4 pass protecting left tackles in the game with like Trent Williams, Laramie Tunsil, and like Rashawn Slater. I'd probably put Armstead up there at like 3 ahead of Slater. The rest of the offensive line is not good in a vacuum in terms of just one-on-one pass protecting. Like, they're just not. Like, Austin Jackson probably is the second best guy, which he's had his good moments. He's had some bad moments as a right tackle for the Dolphins. It just kind of is what it is. But that's not what we saw on Friday. Like, they're not doing that action. They're not doing the stuff that would normally be done to kind of help provide some of that window dressing and illusion for defenses where they're not taking, or where they are taking the cheese and giving, Tua more time to throw. We didn't see that for Skylar Thompson or Mike White, so you have to kind of measure accordingly there. Again, I've said this all offseason, I don't think they're going to go out and make an addition. There was the rumor about the whole James Daniels kind of trade thing, which I think is just kind of a rumor. No solid intel on that. So I think we're going to kind of live and die, but I think if it's me right now, the offensive lineman I would keep left to right, until we know more on Isaiah Wynn, the starting five is probably Armstead, Rob Jones, Brewer, Eichenberg, and Jackson. And to me, the reserves I would keep, you would have Patrick Paul and Kendall Lamb as tackles, Driscoll as like a center, and then Cotton as a guard. Those would be my 9. Moving to the defensive side of the ball, the D-line depth, I've seen people kind of tweet out like, oh, we're not going to have a problem now. I think we know that there's guys that can play in kind of small doses. Like we knew Deshaun Hand last year could play in some of those 7 to 10 snap microdoses Fangio gave him. I think you would probably see him, just kind of based on where he was in that rotation, play a little more this year. But you still have like Sealer, Campbell, Tart, Benito, Jones would be kind of the 4 guys in your interior rotation ahead of him. So like is Deshaun Hand number 5? Is Neville Gallimore 5? Because, whether you keep him or cut him, you're basically paying him $1.8 million no matter what. Stephen Ross might have some questions about that if you do cut him. So if they keep 6, I think right now Hand and Gallimore would probably be my 2, just because Gallimore's positional flexibility. We talked about that on the last episode. I won't necessarily come out and say like it's going to be better than it was a year ago, just because Christian Wilkins is going to be awfully difficult to replace. I don't think people quite realize how good he was at how many different things he was good at. And we're going to take a little bit of a hit there come the regular season. But it was encouraging to see a lot of plays being made on the other side of the line of scrimmage. I thought, and he kind of did this last year, you saw Brendan Pilley kind of have his way with some guys. Neville Gallimore in particular was pretty impressive. I thought Leonard Payne was pretty impressive. That might be a good practice squad candidate, someone to develop. They kind of did what you would hope they would do in a preseason game. Edge defenders, this one is kind of a warning flares up for me. Grayson Murphy, to me, outplayed Quentin Bell, who's kind of gotten all the hype. I thought Murphy played pretty savvy against the run, sort of backdoored that very first play for a tackle for loss. I thought he set pretty strong edges, I don't know what his arm measurement is, but looks like he's got good length for someone who's 6'2", which is an issue you're going to have with Chop Robinson. Neither guy, Murphy or Quentin Bell, looks the part of a rotational player in terms of pass rush. Like the handwork is not there. Murphy was more of a heart and hustle pass rusher at UCLA. Leatu Letu was clearly the guy setting the table. Just needs to really work on his hand placement and moves. Quentin Bell, I thought did okay, setting the edge. Some of the times the runs came his way, he got washed out a couple times. Again, just like Murphy, like there's the hand usage and ability to string together moves and combinations and pass rushing is pretty remedial right now. But that being said, like you already know that Chop and Kamara did not dress or play in that game. So those guys are probably on the team. Emmanuel Ogbah, we kind of know what he is. Word is he's having a pretty good camp and looks like the guy who had 9 sacks in 2020 and 2021. And then I still think at some point Jaylen Phillips is going to come back and at least be a contributor come week 1. So if you have Phillips, Ogbah, Kamara, Chop Robinson, are you going to keep both Grayson Murphy and Quentin Bell? I think there's probably only room for one. And then we still don't know any update on Grayson Murphy's injury coming out of that game. So TBD on him. But he did impress me more than Quentin Bell did. I will say that. The off-ball linebackers, I think it's pretty clear that David Long, Jordan Brooks, Anthony Walker Jr., like those 3 guys are on the team. beyond that, I think it's kind of the Wild West. I think Channing Tindall probably played the best overall, but again, he played in the second halves where you're going up against, practice squad and like UFL type guys. I think he probably earned the chance to play, in a first half of the next preseason game where you're playing against guys who are, 2s and 3s and top practice squad guys. Like, give him the opportunity to get the snaps that you gave to Duke Riley. I think we know what Duke is. I think we know he's a good special teamer. And I think at this point, I would probably say that Channing Tindall's performance probably makes me rethink them keeping Cam Brown as sort of a special teams ace at linebacker. And maybe there's another off-ball spot that opens up, if they keep 5 off-ball guys, if they say they keep Duke and Tindall, I probably wouldn't complain about that. Tindall as a blitzer is kind of what we all thought and hoped he could be coming out of Georgia. I thought he's been a sure tackler kind of every year in preseason, just kind of has some mental awareness issues when it comes to the pass game and what he's supposed to do. You don't see him trigger as quickly as you saw him trigger at Georgia against the run sometimes. But I would say a positive sign. See what he can do against the next kind of tier of competition in the next preseason game. I thought Curtis Bolton flew around the field pretty well. Both of those guys kind of outshowed Zeke Vandenberg to me, but I know Vandenberg's had a strong camp this far, so we'll have to see. Cornerback depth. Okay, we'll put one on the team. Saron Neal, just with the new kickoff rule, coming down and making those 2 tackles and doing what he did as a corner, I think he's on the squad. I think Ethan Bonner is probably on the team too. And what's noticeable, and I'll shout out Chris Kaufman at CK Parrott on Twitter for this, he played pretty well, and they put him in a lot of tougher situations where he's pressing a guy. And again, a lot of what this system coming over from the Ravens to the Dolphins is rooted in is cover 1 and cover 3 stuff. This is a lot of the stuff we saw under Flores and Poyer when they were here. So there's going to be opportunities for teams to kind of expose a corner in man-to-man coverage. And the one play that Ethan Bonner got exposed, the officials missed a face mask on the Ravens receiver. He got his hand on Bonner's face mask, yanked him down, and got free. Otherwise, I thought Ethan Bonner played a pretty damn good game. And I think right now, if you're looking at corners, obviously they're going to have Jalen Ramsey, Kendall Fuller, Kader Kohu. Those are probably your top 3 at the moment. They're not going to give up on a second rounder and Cam Smith after a year. I think Saron Neal and Ethan Bonner are both on the roster as well to give you 6 corner guys. I thought Nick Needham played well. If he doesn't make the Dolphins roster, I think he's probably making another roster. And then I thought Storm Duck did a pretty nice job in the game as well. He's probably a candidate you would want to put on the practice squad and see what you can do. Safety was interesting to me, and maybe it's more of a numbers thing, that Elijah Campbell didn't play, but Marcus May did. And this is one of the concerns I talked about with Evan Morris on the last show, was there's going to be times when you have to play someone other than Javon Holland as sort of that deep middle of the field safety. Marcus May got the most opportunities of anyone in the first half, and it felt like he was probably a step slow on most of those opportunities. And this is against 2s and 3s. So I don't think we really saw Patrick McMorris get any of those opportunities. He was more down in the box. But I would say there's probably more of a door open than I thought, with Marcus May being kind of the 3rd or 4th guy. Patrick McMorris played really, really well, flies downhill well, does everything right, which is kind of exactly what you saw from his tape at Cal and at San Diego State. Like, he plays like a coach's kid. Like, he does everything right. He just always kind of looked a little bit slow. What happens like let's say next week, you probably don't need to play Javon Holland much. What if you throw Patrick McMorris in there against kind of the ones and twos? Does that looking slow kind of show back up on tape? Because I thought he did a really nice job. I would say kind of looking holistically at the rookie class, like just based off the first game, you'd probably think all the rookies who played that were draft picks are going to make it. I think McMorris is probably the one in question. And then I think Grayson Murphy and Storm Duck are probably the two UDFAs with the best shot. That's kind of where I sit. Would want to see more of McMorris against some better competition in the next preseason game. Also want to see what Marcus May can do against some of the better competition, especially if you're going to put him in middle of the field opportunities. Special teams, and we'll wrap this one up. Jason Sanders sure caught a lot of flack from 2021 that lasted through last year. Absolutely drilled the 58-yard field goal, and then, has pretty much been perfect the last season and a half. I don't know what else there really is to say about him at this point. He seems like he's back to being the guy who was the 2020 first-team All-Pro kicker in the NFL, which is a good thing to have. I thought he does a nice job with the mortar kicks and some of the knuckleball stuff with the new kickoff rules. Blake Ferguson would probably be the guy I would take the most issue with. He had by my count, two bad snaps. He had one on the 48-yard field goal and then one on the 58-yard field goal later in the game that Sanders missed. Both of those, Jake Bailey did a nice job of catching those and getting those down. Usually you don't see that inconsistency from Ferguson on field goal snaps. It's usually inconsistency on the long snap in punts that you see some inconsistency in his game with. So, it's early, first game. Hopefully that'll kind of rectify itself. Fans are never going to be, appreciative of Jake Bailey as a punter. I think he's had some pretty bad moments, but you don't necessarily want to boom every punt. You have to give your coverage team a chance to get down there and cover. I think Bailey, for the most part, does a pretty good job of that, even if he's never going to win you like a top 5 or 10 guy in net, punting. But I don't think you should actively be going out and signing the kid who's trying to beg Chris Grier with coffee and donuts or whatever. It's a little sad at this point. There's other leagues you can go to and try out for and stuff like that. It is what it is, though. I thought the coverage units, Saron Neal specifically, were pretty good. But you can easily see, I'm just waiting for, the game where Miami gives up 2 kickoffs returned for a touchdown. Because someone gets hurt and Danny Crossman doesn't end up with all, 10 of his coverage players or something like that. I can already see it coming, where there's going to be a game where, someone has the Ted Ginn game against us. If you know, you know. But I thought they did pretty well otherwise. Pretty cool for Elijah Campbell to not have to play in a preseason game. So that's going to do it for my show tonight. Dolphins Talk Weekly is brought to you by Caneswear. Caneswear is the place to go for officially licensed apparel for the Miami Dolphins, Miami Heat, the Hurricanes, Florida Panthers, and all of the professional and college teams in South Florida. Looking for the latest jersey, a birthday gift, or the newest hat to hit the market of your favorite South Florida team? Check out Caneswear for their overwhelming selection of sports apparel. Located at 2655 South University Drive in Davie, Florida, Caneswear has it all. Not in South Florida? No worries. Visit Caneswear.com to shop their inventory from the comfort of your home, and they'll ship to you. International fans, too. Caneswear.com is the spot that Miami fans shop. That's Caneswear.com. Caneswear.com. That's going to do it for this week's episode of Dolphins Talk Weekly. I will be back next week with a recap of preseason game 2 against the Washington Commanders. Have a great week, everybody. Fins up.